There's a very specific kind of silence that fills the room right after a person realizes, not suspects, not fears, but actually realizes that the thing they avoided for years was never as painful as the avoiding of it. I've been in rooms like that. I've watched it happen. The jaw doesn't drop. The eyes don't fill with tears. What happens is far more interesting and far more disturbing. The body simply deflates, not dramatically, quietly, as though all the muscular tension required to maintain the illusion finally releases at once, and what's left underneath is neither grief nor relief, just a kind of tired astonishment. You know the sound a sail makes when the wind dies? That slow, defeated flap before it goes slack? That's the sound I'm describing, except it's coming from somewhere inside the chest. The ancient Stoics had a word for this, hamartia. It's usually translated as fatal flaw, but in its original use it simply meant missing the mark, an archer's error, not a moral failing, a mathematical one. The arrow flew, the hand was steady, the calculation, however, was wrong. What we call regret is, at its root, arithmetic. And the question I want to spend the next hour with you examining carefully, uncomfortably together is this: why are we so spectacularly, consistently, almost elegantly wrong about the math? Not occasionally wrong, not wrong in random directions, wrong in one specific direction, with a bias so reliable it has been replicated in laboratories across 4 continents, documented in populations from Tokyo to Toronto to Lagos, observed in monks and traders and soldiers and schoolchildren, and yet, and this is the part that should disturb you, never once taught in any school I'm aware of. We know how to calculate compound interest. We know how to estimate caloric intake. We have apps, algorithms, and graduate degrees devoted to forecasting weather, markets, and disease. But the one calculation that governs nearly every important decision a human being makes, the calculation of future pain, we have collectively agreed to leave to intuition. And intuition, as it turns out, is an absolutely terrible actuary. Here is what I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you that the pain you are currently avoiding is not in fact being avoided. It is being converted, transformed, stored in a format that compounds with time and pays out with interest at the moment you are least equipped to receive it. I'm going to show you 3 moments, 3 intellectual fractures, where everything you think you know about regret and future suffering reveals itself to be not just incomplete, but structurally inverted, where the safe choice wasn't safe, where the painful choice wasn't painful, where the avoidance cost more than the catastrophe. I'm going to introduce you to a woman in 1974 who made a decision that neuroscientists still argue about today, a market crash that was predicted by the very same mechanism used to explain why people stay in loveless marriages, and a philosopher who died without finishing his most important book because he kept waiting for the right emotional conditions. I'm going to give you the arithmetic, not the metaphor of the arithmetic, the actual equations, the error bars, the effect sizes, because what lives in the gap between what you think pain will feel like and what it actually feels like is not a mystery. It is a measurable quantity with a name and a literature and a disturbing predictive validity. And somewhere in this hour, if I'm doing this correctly, you are going to recognize yourself, not as a cautionary tale, not as a patient, as a structure, a predictable, reproducible, elegant pattern of miscalculation that has been running silently in your operating system since the first time someone told you something was going to be okay. It wasn't, but we'll get to that. Let me tell you what we officially believe about regret. The conventional wisdom, the version that appears in self-help books, in commencement speeches, in the careful language of therapists who have been trained to be both accurate and reassuring, goes something like this. Regret is a natural response to loss. It is a signal that something went wrong. It is, in moderate doses, adaptive. It teaches us to do better next time. And the best remedy for regret is action, forgiveness, and forward momentum. That's the poster. That's what they put on the inspirational calendar. And it is not wrong exactly. The way a shadow is not wrong. It simply leaves out most of what's actually there. The official story about regret treats it as reactive, something that arrives after the damage, a consequence. But what the last 40 years of psychological research have been quietly, methodically establishing is that regret isn't just a consequence, it's a process. It begins before the decision, It shapes the decision, it continues through the decision, colors the execution, and then, in the most disturbing finding of all, it retroactively rewrites the memory of the decision, so that you can never quite reconstruct what you actually knew at the time. Regret is not a mirror you hold up after the wreckage. Regret is the weather system you were living inside the entire time, and you simply didn't have the instruments to measure it. The official story says, regret is about the past. What you'll understand by the end of this hour is that regret operates primarily in the future. It is a prediction error, and prediction errors have a very specific anatomy. In 1994, a psychologist named Timothy Wilson and a colleague named Daniel Gilbert, yes, that Daniel Gilbert, the one who wrote Stumbling on Happiness, though this work predates the book by a decade, published a paper in a journal that most people outside of academic psychology have never heard of. The paper described a phenomenon they called affective forecasting. The premise was simple, almost embarrassingly so. People are asked to predict how they will feel in the future about a specific event. They are then tracked, and their actual feelings about that event are measured. And then, here is the anomaly, the predictions are compared to the outcomes. What they found was not that people were slightly off in their predictions. That would have been unremarkable. What they found was that people were systematically, directionally, and measurably miscalibrated in one specific way. They consistently overestimated the duration and intensity of negative emotional responses to bad events, not the existence of negative emotion. That part, people got right. The thing, the divorce, the job loss, the public humiliation, the health scare. Yes, those felt bad, but not as bad, and not for as long as the person had predicted. Not even close. The gap was large enough to be statistically significant across every demographic, every culture, every type of negative event they tested. So people were predicting more pain than they actually experienced. That's interesting. Here's the crack. If people consistently overestimate future pain, why do they not act accordingly? Why does the knowledge that future pain will be less than feared not translate into greater willingness to endure short-term discomfort in exchange for long-term gain? Why does everyone know intellectually that it won't be as bad as I think, and then behave exactly as though it will be? Wilson and Gilbert called this the impact bias. It was the first brick. But the building it would eventually construct took 30 more years, and the shape of it is nothing like what the architects intended. Elena Marchetti grew up in a small town in northern Italy, a place where the streets were old enough to have worn grooves in the cobblestones, and the light in the afternoon came through kitchen windows at an angle that made even ordinary moments feel curated by a painter who specialized in nostalgia. In 1971, she was offered a scholarship to study literature in Rome. She was 22 years old, engaged to a man named Pietro, who was kind, reliable, and deeply rooted the way old trees are rooted, which is to say both by biology and by choice. Elena turned down the scholarship. She told herself it was because of Pietro. She told Pietro it was because of her mother's health. She told her mother it was because Rome was too loud, too expensive, too far. Each story was calibrated for its audience. Each story contained enough truth to function as cover. The real reason, the one she admitted to a researcher named Gianna Torelli in 1974 as part of a longitudinal study on life decisions and emotional outcomes, was that she was afraid the move would be unbearable, that she would be lonely in a way she had never been lonely, that the texture of her days would become foreign and abrasive in ways she couldn't name but could feel vividly in her chest when she imagined walking into a Rome apartment with 2 suitcases and the certainty that she was starting over. She could feel, she said, the exact weight of that loneliness. It was specific, it had mass. 3 years later, Torelli returned. Elena was still in the northern town. Pietro had been loving, then comfortable, then distant in the way of people who have confused familiarity with intimacy. Her mother had recovered entirely. The scholarship would have paid for everything. Torelli asked Elena to rate the loneliness she had predicted in 1971 on a scale of 1 to 10. Elena said, 9, probably a 10. She would have dissolved, she said. She knew herself. Then Torelli asked Elena to rate the loneliness she had actually experienced in her life since 1971. Elena paused for a very long time. 7, she said. Maybe 6. There were moments, but she had adapted. There was always something. You find a way. One question remained, and Torelli hesitated before asking it, because she already knew it would not be answered easily. Do you think, if you had known in 1971 that the loneliness would be a 6 rather than a 10, that you would have gone to Rome? Elena looked out the kitchen window. The afternoon light came through at that angle. She didn't answer for a while. Then she said, "That's a very cruel question." And she was right, it was, but cruelty in the service of precision is sometimes the only honest instrument available. Elena is not a cautionary tale about scholarship. She is a case study in what happens when a person assigns emotional weight to an imagined future state and then builds a life around not testing the prediction. And she is, in the language of the research, unremarkably average, which is the disturbing part. In 1998, a team at Northwestern University recruited 130 participants in the middle of major life transitions, people moving cities, ending relationships, changing careers. They asked each participant to predict their emotional state at 6-month intervals over 2 years. They then measured the actual states at those intervals. The results replicated Wilson and Gilbert. The magnitude of predicted suffering was, on average, 40% higher than the measured suffering. The predicted duration was roughly twice the actual duration. And here is the pattern. The people with the highest predicted pain levels were the least likely to make the change they needed to make. The overcalculation of future pain was not neutral. It was not merely inaccurate. It was operative. It was causing people to not do the things that would have reduced their actual pain. The error in the prediction was generating the outcome. The prediction feared. It's almost elegant, if you have the kind of aesthetic sense that finds tragedies elegant. Here is the structure of the trap. You feel a potential pain in advance. That anticipatory feeling is real. It is felt in the body, experienced as data, treated as information. You make a decision based on that information. The decision involves avoiding the predicted pain. The avoidance generates a different kind of pain, duller, longer, without the sharp clarity of the thing avoided. And because that second pain is lower intensity, you never gather the data that would correct the original prediction. The error never gets updated. It runs version 1.0, unpatched, for decades. The most insidious software is the kind that almost works, because almost working software never triggers the update. Of course, there is a counterargument. There always is, when the data is disturbing enough to attract serious people. The alternative reading of affective forecasting research goes like this. The impact bias is not a cognitive error, it is a design feature. Evolution did not produce a brain optimized for long-term emotional accuracy. It produced a brain optimized for survival, and in the ancestral environment, overestimating pain kept organisms away from lions, cliffs, and rival tribes. The occasional missed scholarship was an acceptable rounding error in the survival function. Martin Seligman, the architect of positive psychology, made a version of this argument in a 2011 paper that was widely cited and not widely interrogated. His position was essentially this: the mind's negativity bias, its tendency to weight bad outcomes more heavily than equivalent good outcomes, is not a malfunction. It is a feature that runs correctly in the environment it was built for, even if that environment no longer exists. There is something almost comforting about this argument. It removes the moral dimension. You're not failing to grow. You're not choosing comfort over meaning. You are simply a rational agent in the wrong century, running an ancestral operating system on a modern problem set. I find the argument simultaneously accurate and completely beside the point. Yes, the overcalculation of pain is ancient. Yes, it was adaptive once. Yes, it probably saved your great-great-great-grandmother from something with teeth. None of that changes what it costs you today. The fact that your knee-jerk flinch reflex was useful when things with teeth actually chased you does not make it useful when the thing with teeth is a difficult conversation with someone you love. Knowing why the compass is broken does not help you navigate. And then there's the proper skeptic, not the defensive skeptic, who rejects discomfort dressed as rigor. The genuine kind, the one who looks at this data and asks, how do you know the people who stayed weren't right to stay? It's a fair question. When we measure Elena's loneliness and find it was a 6 rather than a 10, we're measuring loneliness as she experienced it, in the life she actually lived. But we cannot measure the loneliness of the version of Elena who went to Rome. That path closed when she chose the other one. The counterfactual, by definition, is unavailable for measurement. The psychologists have a response to this, and it's not entirely satisfying, which is actually one of the things I find most trustworthy about it. The response involves what they call proxy populations, people who made the choice Elena didn't, in circumstances sufficiently similar to allow comparison. And when you compare self-reported well-being across large populations of people who avoided versus pursued major life changes that produced equivalent short-term disruption, the pursued group consistently reports higher long-term satisfaction by margins that are not trivial. But here's what the proxy population cannot tell you. Whether Elena specifically, with her specific nervous system and her specific relationship to solitude and her specific capacity for reinvention, would have thrived in Rome or crumbled. The research tells you what happens on average. You are not average. You are a specific person in a specific situation making a specific calculation. The research can tell you that your calculator is biased. It cannot tell you the correct answer. That is both its limitation and its dignity. In January of 2008, a risk analyst named Michael Burry sent a letter to his investors. This is by now a famous letter, the one that preceded the housing market collapse he had correctly predicted years in advance, the trade that became the subject of a book and a film and a dozen business school case studies. But the letter I'm interested in is not that one. It's a letter he sent in 2005 to a man whose name has been almost entirely scrubbed from the public record, in which he described something that had nothing to do with mortgages. He described what he called the collective impact bias in financial markets. His argument, which was not well received, was that market participants systematically overestimate the short-term pain of correction and underestimate the long-term pain of avoidance, and that this produces bubbles, not because people are irrational, because they are predictably, architecturally rational in a way that generates irrational aggregate outcomes. Each individual actor, correctly predicting that a correction would be painful, defers the correction. Each deferral adds pressure to the system. The pressure compounds. The final correction, the one that could not be deferred further, is not merely painful, it is catastrophic, exactly as catastrophic in the aggregate as the sum of all the avoided smaller pains that were individually rational to avoid. What Burry was describing, in the language of financial risk management, was the same phenomenon Wilson and Gilbert were describing in the language of psychology. The avoided pain does not disappear, it accumulates, it compounds, and when it finally arrives, it arrives at the scale of the avoidance itself, the market, in other words, is running the same arithmetic as Elena, and getting it wrong in exactly the same direction. What does that tell you about the arithmetic? I want to talk about what 40 years of compounding avoidance actually looks like. Not as an abstraction, as an anatomy. There is a man, I'll call him Armand, though that is not his name. And I'm drawing here from a composite of documented case histories rather than any single individual, which is actually more honest than using one, because the pattern I'm describing is precisely its generality. There is a man named Armand, who spent his 20s being reasonably accomplished, his 30s being increasingly busy, his 40s being impressively defended, and his early 50s arriving at a specific Tuesday afternoon in October, during which he sat in his car in a parking garage for 45 minutes and could not identify a single thing in his life that he had chosen because he actually wanted it. Not nothing. He had wanted some of them, once, but wanting something once, and then organizing your entire life around not losing it rather than deepening it. That is not the same as wanting it. That is ownership without residency. The archaeology of that parking garage Tuesday is not complicated. It is in fact disarmingly simple. Every year there had been 1 or 2 or 3 small avoidances, a difficult conversation not had, a desire not named, a path not taken because the path that required less renovation of the self was also available. None of them catastrophic, each of them individually defensible, each of them in the language of a reasonable person making reasonable decisions under reasonable uncertainty, entirely understandable. But avoidances do not stack. They do not sit in a warehouse, inert, awaiting processing. They organize, they form coalitions, they construct an identity out of what has not been chosen. And that identity, the identity of a person defined by their avoidances, is among the most difficult of all identities to revise, because revision requires acknowledging what was avoided, and acknowledging what was avoided means confronting the very pain that was predicted and escaped. The bill arrives, eventually. It always arrives. The only variable is the denominator. Here is the paradox. The affective forecasting system, the brain's architecture for predicting future emotional states, is most reliable when you need it least, and least reliable when you need it most. When the decision is small and the stakes are low, the predictions tend to be reasonably accurate. Choose a restaurant, pick a movie, select a vacation destination. The emotional simulation is decent, the hedonic returns are roughly as expected, the system performs adequately for the problems it was not designed to solve. But when the stakes are high, when the decision involves a significant reorientation of self, a meaningful departure from established patterns, a choice that will echo across years rather than afternoons, this is precisely when the prediction machinery overloads, the signal gets noise, the simulation runs too hot, the predicted pain inflates to proportions that bear no relationship to any empirical outcome in any study ever conducted. This is the paradox. The instrument is unreliable in direct proportion to how much you need it. A compass that spins wildly in the presence of magnetic fields would be useful on a flat, empty plane, which is to say it would be useful exactly when you are not lost. And we know this. Not abstractly, personally. Everyone reading this has had the experience of dreading something profoundly, confronting it, and finding that the experience was not pleasant, not easy, but manageable, survivable, perhaps even revelatory. Everyone has experienced the discrepancy between predicted and actual pain. We call these moments not as bad as I thought. We treat them as pleasant surprises. We do not typically treat them as data. If we treated them as data, we would update the model. The model updated would predict less fear. Less fear would produce more action. More action would generate more data. More data would produce a progressively more accurate prediction system, calibrated not to an ancestral environment, full of things with teeth, but to the actual landscape of a contemporary human life. The puzzle is not why we fail to do this. The puzzle is why we fail to do this despite understanding at some level exactly how the trap is constructed and exactly what it costs. Soren Kierkegaard spent much of his adult life in love with a woman named Regine Olsen. He proposed to her in 1840. She accepted. He broke the engagement in 1841. The reasons he gave publicly were opaque. The reasons he gave privately, in journals that have been studied with the intensity usually reserved for religious texts, were complex. But they converge on something recognizable. He believed that committing to her would prevent him from doing the work he needed to do. He believed he could not love her the way she deserved to be loved and also be the thinker he needed to be. He predicted that the life with her would cost him the work, and the work, the examination of anxiety, despair, and the nature of human choice, was what he was for. He spent the rest of his life writing about her, not always explicitly, often obliquely, but her shadow falls across most of the concluding, unscientific postscript, across repetition, across the sickness unto death. He described in language of extraordinary precision the phenomenology of a self defined by the choice it did not make. He never finished his project. He died at 42, in the middle of what would have been his most important work. The conditions never became quite right. There was always another volume to write first, another thinker to respond to, another layer of the problem to expose before the synthesis could begin. The tragedy is not that he chose work over love. That choice was his to make and his to live with. The tragedy, the one that resonates across the 180 years since his death, is that he predicted a cost to the choice and paid a different cost entirely. He predicted that loving Regine would cost him his work. What actually happened was that losing Regine became the engine of his work, the wound that generated the examination. The predicted pain never arrived, the unpredicted pain ran everything. And so a genius built the most sophisticated philosophical apparatus of his century for understanding human anxiety and human choice, and never applied it to himself. Or rather, he applied it to himself, and the application kept running without terminus. In the same direction, compounding, because the one variable it couldn't incorporate was the error of the original prediction. There is something in this that I find either deeply ironic or deeply instructive, and I confess I have not yet decided which. So let me tell you what the arithmetic actually says. If the brain accurately detects which choices will produce regret, and then mislabels that detection as fear of the action, rather than fear of the inaction, then the experience of fear in the face of a significant decision is not an obstacle to correct choice. It is the most reliable signal you have of where the correct choice lies, the thing that frightens you most in the context of a meaningful decision, where both paths are available to you, is, statistically speaking, the right direction. Not because courage is rewarded by a just universe. The universe is not just in the moral sense, but because the fear is not arbitrary. It is downstream of a neurological process that has correctly identified where you are most alive, most capable, most oriented toward the version of yourself that your future self will need to have been. I want to be careful here. I am not saying do the thing that frightens you. That is recklessness dressed as insight. Fear is not uniformly informative. There is fear that is information and fear that is noise, and the architecture of distinguishing them is a separate subject for a separate hour. What I am saying is that the fear associated with a meaningful choice, the fear that lives at the intersection of genuine possibility and genuine risk, is not what you think it is. It is not the predicted pain of the action. It is the accurate detection of the pain of inaction, relabeled by the proximity bias, transformed from signal to deterrent. When Elena felt the weight of loneliness, that specific heavy 9 or 10 loneliness she predicted if she went to Rome, she was not feeling the loneliness of the life she was about to choose in order to avoid Rome. Her brain had seen it. It was trying to tell her. It had the data. It had the label wrong. When Armand, decade by decade, felt the anxiety of each small avoidance and interpreted that anxiety as warning against the action, each conversation, each desire, each departure from the comfortable path, he was not receiving warnings against those actions. He was receiving reports on the life he was constructing by not taking them. The arithmetic of regret is not complicated. What is complicated is that we have been reading it upside down. I told you at the start that this would end without resolution. I want to make good on that promise. I'm not going to tell you to go do the frightening thing. I'm not going to tell you it will be fine. I'm not going to assemble the data into a prescription and hand it to you in the form of 5 actionable steps, because the data does not support that kind of confidence. And the thing I want you to leave with is not comfort, it is calibration. Here is what I know. The gap between predicted pain and actual pain is real, documented, and directionally consistent. The gap is larger for meaningful choices than trivial ones. The gap runs in different directions for action and inaction. The fear associated with significant choices is not random noise. It contains information, mislabeled. The label can be corrected. The correction is difficult. It requires sitting with the fear long enough to ask what it is actually describing, which is not the thing in front of you, but the life behind the choice you are considering not making. That is the arithmetic. Elena is in her 80s now, if she is still alive. I don't know whether she is. I know that the afternoon light still comes through kitchen windows in northern Italian towns at that angle that makes even ordinary moments feel curated. I know that she gave an interview in 1991, late in the study's follow-up period, in which she was asked if she had any regrets. She laughed. She said, "I have one regret. But it is a very well-organized regret. I have thought about it from every angle. I understand exactly how it works. It does not surprise me anymore." I have been thinking about that sentence ever since I read it. Specifically, I have been thinking about whether a regret so thoroughly understood is still a regret, or whether understanding transforms it into something else entirely. A scar, perhaps, or a grammar. The scaffolding of a self-knowledge that arrived too late to change the outcome, but exactly on time to change the person. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And I think that genuine not knowing is more honest and more useful than anything a confident conclusion would offer. Kierkegaard spent his career arguing that the self is not a thing you have. It is a relation, a continuous anxiety-producing, never-finished act of becoming. He argued that the deepest human suffering is not the suffering of pain, but the suffering of failing to become, of living in the permanent postponement of the self you were capable of being. He called it despair. He defined it as the failure to be the self you are, not the self you want to be, not the self you imagine being under better conditions, the self you already are, underneath the avoidances, the predictions, the very well-organized regrets. The arithmetic of regret is not a calculation you run once and file. It is a running total. It updates every time you make a choice and every time you don't. It is running right now as you sit with whatever this has stirred. I want to leave you with only one question, because one question, honestly held, is worth more than any number of answers. What is the fear you have been treating as a warning that was actually a report? Think about it carefully. Take your time, because the answer when it arrives is going to require something from you.